Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gamesty here. This is the Heroic Raid Guide for Thok the Bloodthirsty. And before we begin, just a fair warning that this video is going to be very long. There are a lot of things to cover in this fight. It's a very difficult encounter. Easily the most difficult up to this point in the zone. So with that, let's get started. So there are two main components in this fight that provide the majority of the difficulty. The first is the severe healing requirement for the normal phase, while he's being tanked and casting Deafening Screech. And the second is the overall strategy, positions, and kiting for the kite phases. So to handle the first, the healing, this is where your raid composition is obviously important. And there are a lot of ways to do this, so I'll talk about the setup that we ended up using after trying a variety of them, and then of course some of the alternatives that you can try with your own raid. So the composition that we ended up using was 3 healers and 2 tanks. And it's somewhat important to also note the healers that we're using. The strongest is our Resto Druid, and then kind of equal would be me as a Mistweaver Monk and our Holy Paladin as the third. Then 2 tanks, doesn't really matter what the tanks are on this fight, to be honest. So the reason we settled on this is after trying a variety of anywhere from 2 to 4 healers and 1 to 2 tanks, this all offered the most stability, allowing us to go for pretty lengthy normal phases while also maintaining control over the rest of the fight without losing too much. So if you use a 1 tank method, which is somewhat popular, the difficulty, of course, is you have to provide a bunch of additional healing on the tank that you otherwise would not need to. It also makes ad control, particularly for the bats that we'll talk about in a moment, much more difficult. And you can still get away with it with 3 healers or less, but it's likely going to mean you have to spend less time in the normal phase, which means overall you have to make up that lost DPS in the kite phase. Similarly, if you use 4 healers and 2 tanks, which is a very common setup as well, you obviously get a lot more stability in the main phase, and usually with this setup you're going to want to go close to the maximum stack count on acceleration, which is 30. But again, with 4 healers you have very low DPS, so you really have to make that up in other areas. And we'll talk in the next section about why going up to the max stacks is not actually that much extra DPS. Believe it or not. So we found, like I said, 3 healers, 2 tanks offered the most stability, along with a good mix of DPS in there as well. So to handle the healing requirements for the normal phase, it's important to understand a few basic mechanics. And just like in normal difficulty, this boss will cast Deafening Screech every time he reaches full energy, and his energy regen rate is increased by acceleration stacks, which will go up 1 stack every time he screeches. So that's all standard. However, what you may not realize on normal difficulty that applies on heroic is that the cast time between screeches, or the frequency, actually caps out very quickly. So if you look in the top left there, you can see a basic chart taken from a combat log entry on this fight, and these average out to be pretty much the same every attempt. So the stack count on the left is how many counts of acceleration, or in other words, how many screeches he's cast in this normal phase. And then the split time is the time from that particular acceleration stack or screech to the previous one, the one prior. So if there isn't one prior, then it's just the start of the phase until that one. So you can see for the first acceleration or first screech cast, it's about 13.5 seconds from the start of the phase until that first cast goes off. Then between the first and the second cast, it's about 11, and then 7, and then 6, then 5, and then 2.4. And believe it or not, once you reach cast number 6 of Screech in any given normal phase, you have capped out. This is now the minimum time between screeches that will be used for the remainder of the phase until the phase is over. And it averages to about 2.4 seconds every time. So what this essentially means is that very quickly you will reach the maximum incoming damage point on the raid. And this is important to note, of course, because not only will you require the maximum healing that you can output once you reach 6 stacks and beyond, but it also means that the interrupts are as frequent as they will ever be once you get to 6 and beyond. So if you have heavy caster DPS and people are having difficulty because of the interrupts and all that stuff, once you get to that 6 or beyond point, that's going to be the maximum amount. The DPS is never going to improve beyond that. So with that in mind, it's kind of important to keep in mind that you have to plan around how you're going to handle these normal phases based on not only the healing that you can do, but how it affects your DPS and how far into the phase you go. So to reach that fastest point of accelerations and screeches, the 6th stack, it only takes about 45 seconds into the phase for that to occur. Beyond that, every additional stack is another 2.4 seconds or so, maybe 2.5 if you want to round it. So the difference between going from 25 stacks, say, to 30, which is around the cap, that's not very much time. It's about 12 seconds. So with the screeches interrupting caster DPS as well, you have to really consider how much extra DPS is our raid making up in that difference between 25 and 30 stacks, or 20 and 25, or whatever it is that you decide on. You'll find that it's actually pretty low. The DPS difference in just a few stacks, even though you're trying to cap out, is not very significant, even if you consider that you're doing that 3 times across the fight. So just something to keep in mind when you're considering how you're going to handle the healing. So the method that we ended up settling on when we were getting our first kill was essentially to do the max stack count based on the cage phase that we were in, or the phase in general. And we'll talk more about this in the next section a little bit. But essentially, our max stack count was around 20. So we'd hit the 20th marker after using our cooldowns appropriately, and then force the transition to the kite phase. On some phases, however, we didn't want to go up to 20 because of other things that were going on, so we'd force it earlier, around 15 or so. Nowadays, we're going a little bit higher. We're able to, with gear improvements and whatnot, we go up to 25 or so. But again, the difference in terms of DPS gain is quite minor in that 5-stack difference. So ultimately, it's more about survival and transitioning, especially when you're learning the fight, than it is to trying to going to some arbitrary stack count value. Just go to whatever you're comfortable with early on, especially transition the phase, go through another cycle and start the stacks again on the next round, and just try to push into the fight as far as you can. You'll find that things are much easier to learn when you get more practice overall, rather than just trying to push for that arbitrary stack count number. So the order that you open and activate cages is important, and I'll talk about briefly, what order we use, which is pretty standard actually, and why. So the first cage that we open after the first kite phase is the front left one, which is the green one, and second is the front right, which is blue, and then finally the back right, which is red. And the reason for this order is primarily due to the way it lines up your cooldowns, essentially. So you utilize your major survival cooldowns the first normal phase before you've opened a cage. Then you do the first cage, the green one, which spawns bats, and bats offer kind of a difficult thing to deal with. So you don't go for very many stacks. You don't stay in that phase as long as you did the first one. And then the second cage, after you've done the green one, which is the blue one on the right, the blue cage, you have your cooldowns up again. So you can go for a lot longer in the normal phase once again. And then the final red phase, you can't really go very long because of the flame mechanic on the ground anyway. So by splitting it up, doing the green cage first with the bats, you don't need to go very long in that phase because of the bats anyway. So you can use your big cooldowns the first normal phase and the third normal phase, skipping the cooldowns on the second and the fourth. That's the basic idea of that order. So we'll talk about bats and all that in the next section. But basically, do the green cage first, blue cage second, red cage third, and that will generally be the easiest setup for you. So the first addition on Heroic is Captive Cave Bats, and these adds will spawn shortly after you open the first cage, the green cage, and they will rush in from the left of the room toward your raid. And they have normal threat tables, but because they're sort of flying from up above, threat can be a little difficult. So make sure you use any misdirection type effects to get them on your tank if possible, especially if you're one tanking it. That said, mechanically they act just like the bats that you might have dealt with in the trash before the boss. So every once in a while, a few of the bats will use Vampiric Frenzy, which basically shoots frequent bolts at random players that heals the bat and does damage to the targeted player. Now these are stunnable, these bats, so the best thing you can really do is, in addition to gathering them up quickly and DPSing them as fast as possible, when you see them start to shoot bolts out, use an AE stun. You can use single target stuns, but it's difficult to, in the mess, target the right bat that's actually frenzying, because they're not all going to be shooting bolts at the same time. So better bet is to just use area of effect stuns and kind of rotate those when they shoot off the bolts, and that will prevent a significant amount of damage. But otherwise, the main goal here is just burn them down quickly, because if they survive too long, in addition to all the other damage on this phase, this is the highest damage phase that you'll face, things can get very dicey very quickly. So get those bats down very fast. In terms of positioning, I'll talk about that in the position section, but essentially we have our melee kind of in one spot so that the tank that has the bats can stack with the melee without forcing any phase transition accidentally. And then our ranged and our melee can all attack the bats safely without getting in front of the boss and getting breathed on and all that stuff. So you can see we pull the bats to the green melee marker essentially, and that's where we kill them off. The second addition on Heroic is the Starved Yeti, which will spawn after you open the second cage, the blue cage on the right. And this Yeti, again, acts just like the Yeti that you saw in the trash before the boss. So basically his role is to run across the room every few seconds and try to run through someone and kill them, and just kind of be an annoyance. Now he'll use his Wrecking Ball about every 10 seconds or so, and run to kind of an opposite random location around the room. And there's a red marker just like before, so you just have to watch for that and get out of the way of it. Now generally speaking, DPS on the Yeti is wasted DPS that could be on the boss. So unless you have extremely high damage for this fight and can afford to kill the Yeti, most cases you're going to just ignore him for the remainder of the fight once you open the second cage and go from there. So it's not that difficult to dodge him. You just have to be cognizant of where he is and when his next charge is occurring. So watch your boss timers for that, and then look for the red marker so you can see the path that he's going to take from his current location to the red marker. He does kind of curve it sometimes a little bit, so it's important to kind of steer very wide if possible. So here you can see him charging kind of to the left, but there's no one in danger right there. So anyway, the Yeti is pretty simple to deal with compared to the bats. Overall, it's much easier and really not that significant in the grand scheme of things. It just requires a little bit more attention from all your raid members. The Wrecking Ball itself will one-shot most players, so it's important that you don't get hit by it accidentally. So there you can see him charging again. Now, before you even begin attempts on this, the most important thing to figure out in this fight is your raid positions for various phases and your kiting paths. So to help illustrate the method that we use that works really well, we'll use a little diagram and some animations here. So as we begin, you can see here a top-down view of the room. Very clearly, this is basically as you enter the room, the layout of the room itself. So the entrance to the room is down to the south or the bottom, and it extends, the hallway itself extends down below the screen pretty far. You can't really see the rest of it. And then you have the inner ring 8-sided ring that's clearly marked on the screen there, and you'll see it in the video as well. So with that, we throw in some raid markers. So we've got the 5 raid markers: blue, green, purple, red, and yellow. And it's important to note that in terms of scale, the markers and general markings on this diagram are much larger than they would be in the room. But this is just to make it easier to see visually and the diagram here on the animation. But in reality, they'll be much tinier than they appear. But the positions are what are important here. So with those 5 raid markers, now we add 2 little green circles. And the important part about these circles is that they're the designation for the radius of your ground-based heal effects, which are extremely important on this fight. So you have efflorescence from druids and healing rains from shamans primarily, and these are, I believe, 12-yard radius. So these green circles are centered around the bottom 2 corners of the inner ring. So you can see those on the diagram there. The center of those circles are targeted at that corner, and then the 2 markers are opposite at the maximum edges of those circles. And these 2 markers will be used for most of your raid's positioning at various times in the fight. So if you drop your efflorescence or healing rains at the corners in the bottom left and bottom right respectively, and then put your markers at the correct angle, kind of shown in the diagram here, then they'll be within the heal radius, but still far enough from one another that players in one marker don't get too close and trigger the next phase before you're ready for it. So use your healing ground effects to figure out where your markers need to be, and then place them appropriately as you see in the diagram. Next, we have a few basic markers for important players or NPCs. So Thok is clearly the largest red rectangle here. The J red rectangle is for the jailer. And then finally the pink star with a K is for the kiter, the current player that is being targeted by Thok with Fixate and is generally the kiter at the time. And then finally, we have our series of positional markers. And these are the designated positions that kiters will run to throughout the kite phase, depending on the starting positions and all that stuff. So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. And there are 2 sets of these that are essentially mirrored on opposite rooms or opposite sides of the room from one another. So here you can see the first set starting from A on the left and then B on the right and so on. And then the other set is mirrored, so we start with A on the right, B on the left, and it's just like the other one, just opposites. So with the diagram roughly explained, now we'll see it in action here and go through the basic phases of the fight. So to begin, you have your 3 cages in the 3 corners of the room, with the back left corner being the only one without a cage, of course. So to begin the fight, you pull Thok to the bottom left cage, which is the marker for A that you see here. And you can see the general positioning that he starts in. He's faced toward the cage, and this is the general rule. You always face him toward the cage with the side of the boss right up next to the 2 markers that you have there. So in this case, the first position, we pull him roughly toward A, toward the cage, with the side right up against the green and the blue markers for the raid positions. This will allow primarily at least the green position, which is the melee position, in the back to get in melee range and attack the boss. But often both positions are within melee range. You just have to adjust very slightly. And then the tank, of course, is in front, and that's all there is to that. So you have this basic position for both the cage on the bottom left, so at the start of the fight, until his first kite phase, and then the next normal phase as well, when you're actually, after you've opened this bottom left cage, you're still tanking him here. And then we go to the other position on the right, which is toward the B marker here, and the same basic method is used. He faces the cage, this time with his right side facing toward the raid, since he's kind of in a mirror position. And you can see red and purple here are the raid positions within melee range. And then the final normal standard position is in the top right, and when you open the final red cage. And here we only have one raid position because of the fire that's placed on the ground. We'll talk about that in a moment. But essentially you have, instead of side-to-side positions, you just have a melee position in the front and then the range position in the back. And the range position is indicated by the yellow marker, roughly. Since you won't have 5 raid markers, you can only have one of those actually marked in a designated spot. So we just mark the range one, and the melee are obviously just in melee range of the boss. Alright, so now let's look at the kite phases and how that actually plays out. So for kite phases 1 and 2, you're always starting in the same start position, where Thok is facing toward the A position on the left. And once the kite phase begins, the kiter goes from around A, where they started, wherever the raid is, to the next marker, which is B on the right. So they go toward the opposite cage, and Thok will follow along that path. Meanwhile, the rest of the raid has either moved to the center where the jailer is pulled, so they're not in the path of Thok at the time, or they're behind Thok so that they can still melee and stuff, but they're chasing him along. So kiter goes from A to B, and then from B, Thok will only reach about halfway between A and B before his first fixate ends. So the next target for fixate is usually someone around B already. That player goes to C, which is right up against the far wall, the same wall that they were going toward before. Once that player hits that wall, they hug the wall and go along it up to marker D. They'll reach around the D marker area by the time the second fixate ends because he's getting faster. The third kite player will then be targeted, and they will move across the opposite side of the room toward E. So you can see here, even though D and E are not completely opposite one another, the third player is basically going toward the center of the opposite wall where the E marker is located. Once that player reaches E, they'll probably have to kite a little bit longer, so they go toward the back, which is up toward F for the last few seconds of the kite, just so that Thok doesn't get close enough to eat them, because there's a little bit of issue there sometimes. From the F position, Thok will choose his fourth fixate target, and that player will generally be in the center somewhere or toward the hallway. And they will run down the hall toward the entrance of the room, kind of where G is indicated, but it's much further down the hall than you can actually see on the screen here. So it's toward the G marker, but it's way back, because Thok's going to be going very fast. So this fourth target player needs to be far away from the boss by the time he's about to target in case they're selected. And you'll also want movement speed bursts or boosts if possible for this fourth kite. Then the final kite on the fifth target goes from the center again, roughly, where most of the raid will be hanging out, to the back of the room at H, the final position. And once his fixate ends here, he will be transitioning into the normal phase again because the cage will be opened, and so there won't be another kite target after that. So at most, he'll end his fixate on the player that's going to the H marker. Once again, for this last kite, the player will need to be very far away in case they get targeted, and maybe even use some movement boosts. Now for kite phase number 3, which is started when you're at the cage on the right this time, you just do exactly what you did before, but everything is mirrored. Since your raid is starting on the right side rather than the left, again, the first kiter player goes from A to B. Thok will get about halfway to B. The next targeted player goes to C, and when they reach the wall, then they move up the wall toward D on the left. Next targeted player in the center runs across to the opposite wall toward E, and again, when they hit the wall, they'll probably have to go up a bit toward F. And then next targeted player from the center makes sure they're far away from the boss at this time. They're going to go way down the hall toward G, but well past it, basically to the entrance of the room, down the hall. and then the final kite player once again goes to the back of the room to H at the very end. And once they get there, the kite phase will end, and you get back in positions for the final part of the fight. So, again, the first two kite phases are the same since you start in the same position on the left, and then this third kite phase is mirrored from that. You're starting on the right. Now, to maximize your DPS throughout the fight, you're going to need to find tricks to help you improve your DPS overall in the kite phase. And there are a lot of theories that you can find online about how to properly force fixate targets on certain players and, allow other people to DPS and all that good stuff. And I assure you that any theory that you find online that you may have read, we tested it and disproved it. We tried so many different ways to do it, things we read and our own theories and all that stuff. And the fact of the matter is, there does not seem to be any 100% reliable way to force fixate targets on particular players that you want them to be on. For example, if you start the fixate with 2 or 3 players outside of melee range that have been outside of melee range, that have also taken damage from Deafening Screech on the phase prior, those players are most likely to be targeted by the first fixate. And if one of those players gets targeted by the first fixate, one of the players that's opposite that other player that was at ranged in the first 2 or 3 people is most likely to be targeted by the second fixate, and they will ping-pong it in most cases. But it is not 100% guaranteed. So these kind of things, after you try it a few times and it's like, oh, it looks like it's working. Well, the reality is you just got lucky, and the likelihood is increased in those situations, but it's not guaranteed. And what you're really looking for in this fight on the kite phase is guarantees, which are hard to come by. So ultimately, what you instead are forced to do is put the fixate on one of a few random potential targets at any given time, and you will know who those targets can be very reliably. However, beyond the first few fixates, then it can pretty much be anybody except tanks. So again, you need to adjust accordingly. So here you can see we're just running through some footage of the fixates, and I'll talk briefly about what we're doing and why. So the main idea, you saw the animation that shows our kite path, and this is a kite path for non-warlock raids. If you have a warlock portal, you can probably go for more than the 5 fixates that we do. But if you don't have a warlock, which is kind of how I'm designing the strategy video, then that's going to be your best bet, is to go 5. Anyway, the reason that we do the first 3 paths the way we do kind of around this main room is to allow DPS, especially melee DPS, to attack the boss during that phase. So during the first 3 kiters, or kiting periods, those DPS can pretty much full-time attack the boss, and they're not in danger, for the most part, of being killed by him or being targeted by fixate. So here's the phase begins. You can see all our ranged and our healers are moving off toward the first position, so that any one of us is a valid target for fixate. We can't guarantee that one of us will be targeted over the others, so we all move out until we're certain that we're not targeted. And then the next player, just like in the animation, goes out to the same wall and keeps him kind of in the center here. And because he's going slow enough at this point, all our melee DPS can follow behind him and attack him freely. They can just burn him down while the casters and the tanks are dealing with the jailer, pretty much. And then the third kiter, which you see I'm doing here, goes across. So again, the melee can keep up with him for the most part and attack him here. At this point and beyond, however, he's too fast. For the last 2 kiter targets, he's much too fast for melee to keep up. So pretty much everyone is a valid target at this point. They have to stay in the center and be ready for him to target them. But that's the basic idea. So to improve your DPS, let your melee attack the boss while he's close enough and slow enough to do so. If they stay behind him, generally speaking, they'll be safe. While your ranged can attack the boss and or the jailer. You just have to make sure the jailer dies in time to open the cage when you need to, but not sooner. You don't want it to die too early, because then you're wasting DPS that could have been on the boss. Now there is one situation where 1 out of 5 attempts or 1 out of 10 or whatever, the boss will kill your melee that are chasing behind him. And this is just a rare occurrence that's a bug of some kind. So there you can see the boss turned for no apparent reason, even though he was looking toward the fixated target that was by the cage. And I'm just going to repeat this clip over and over. And I apologize for the quality of this particular clip. It was taken from the Twitch stream, basically. But, so you can see it's chasing our druid healer, and then as he's about to cast his next fixate, he quickly turns for no apparent reason and looks at someone else. And this could be, some random threat glitch, or who knows what, but we've seen this numerous times, and when it occurs, it's really just shitty. There's not much you can do about it. But it's a necessary evil because you need the DPS, and if you have melee DPS like we do, we can't afford not to attack the boss. So if this occurs for your raid, well, too bad, try again. Most of the time it will not happen. He will continue facing the way he's supposed to, he won't do any weird shenanigans, and he will just fixate on the next person that's over there on the same side, and your melee can stay behind him. If you want to be really safe, your melee can back out just before a new fixated target is selected, but generally that's not necessary and you shouldn't really have to rely on it. So I just wanted to show this clip briefly as an example of this bug that can and will occur on occasion, but it doesn't mean your strategy is bad or people are doing something wrong, usually. It's just a rare occurrence sometimes. So for some of the more complicated fights in the past, obviously I like to do a little walkthrough at the end. So you can skip this if you don't want this section, but I'll just talk through exactly what we're doing here on this fight. So you can see the basic positions that I talked about in the animation. So we've got our range group at blue here with 2 of our 3 healers, our melee at green, and then we have 1 extra person in the back so that both these main groups near the boss only have 4 people at one time. This will allow the tank that's not tanking the boss at the time when they come in to not worry about forcing the transition. So during this period, we're basically doing standard healing until we reach about 7 stacks. This is where the stacks have maxed out, and of course I talked about before, the screeches are going to occur at their maximum rate at this point. So when we reach 7, we use personal survival cooldown, so just mitigate some of the damage a bit for a few more stacks. Then once we get up to 11 or 12, then we use some healing cooldowns, along with any minor raid cooldowns. So here, I kind of will throw in my, I can't think, monk heals. And then around 18 to 20 or so, our druid will use Tranquility with the Hand of Protection for one of the paladins. And then once we get beyond 20 and the Tranquility has sort of run its course, then we stack up and force a transition. So that's the first normal phase, basically. Once the kite phase begins, all the ranged and healers run toward the first position in case they are targeted. As soon as that first target is selected, it's safe to go toward the boss. And as a healer, what I try to do is not get targeted if I can by the first 2 fixates. So after the first fixate is selected, you might have seen I went up into melee range of the boss to act as a melee. And that way, since if you're in melee range and there are enough other valid targets, he won't select you in most cases. So here you can see I was targeted by the 3rd fixate, so I go to the 3rd marker and then run along the wall toward the back. And then the 4th person is far enough away that they can run fast enough up the hall to get away from him. Meanwhile, the rest of the healers are hanging out in the middle, trying to keep everyone topped off. And then the final person, looks to be me again, is trying to keep max distance. And this is really fast. Like, his movement is really fast. You're probably going to need a boost. I should have just rolled a couple times before, but I thought I wasn't going to need it. So I ended up using my engineer boots. But once this cage is opened, the person that was running back, which is me in this case, is going to need a minor cooldown, especially if they get targeted by the dot, because the the first Screech or whatever occurs pretty frequently after that, and the person likely will barely be in range. You also want to make sure you don't run too close behind the boss and get tail swiped, because that will occur around the same time as the Screech. In this phase, this is the most difficult in terms of healing and damage incoming. The best thing you can do is stay on top of dispels of that dot. It will occur very frequently, probably more frequently than you can keep up with the spells. So any outside dispels are very helpful. Priest mass dispels, shaman personal dispels, rogues, stuff like that. But essentially your goal is to stack up the bats quickly on your melee position. Again, with 4 melee in the green, our tank with the bats can stand there and not worry about transitioning accidentally, which is kind of the main goal here. So once the bats are dead, you can go for a few more stacks, and again, it just depends on your comfort level, but most of your cooldowns will not be available at that time. So we go up to about 15 or so stacks after the bats are dead, and then transition on that one. Then the kite phase is the same again, just like the first time, since we're starting in the same basic position. So first 2 kiters going along the opposite wall to try to put the boss as far over as possible. You want the boss's position at the end of the second fixate to be a little bit beyond the inner ring. So you can see his feet be slightly beyond the inner ring. This will allow the third fixate target that he's chasing now to go to the opposite wall and then run along it a little bit and not be in danger of getting eaten. He'll stop before he reaches them. Now during this kite phase, this is the most difficult kite phase to heal as well because of the severe damage and the number of dispels. So again, the best thing you can do is stay on top of dispels here. Positioning will also help you a lot. So again, keeping the first 3 kite targets kind of all around the same area, that'll help as well. But players that have to run off by themselves for the last couple kites should again use personal cooldowns, especially if they get targeted by the dot and they can't dispel it off themselves. You may even have a healer run with 1 or 2 of those players if needed, but it's risky. So you can see there, once the 5th kiter was chosen, the rest of the raid got to this side of the room and got in position. So these are the same as before, just mirrored. Ranged position is the red, closest to the cage. The melee one is the purple. We have 1 more person in the back. And this phase, the goal is basically to repeat what we did the first normal phase. So try to go up to 20 or as close as we can. Usually we can't go quite as high because there is extra damage from the frost debuff that's being cast. And we may not have all our cooldowns. But the goal is to try to go as high as you can. There's one exception to that rule, is that's if the Yeti during this phase targets the wall right near you. You'll see a red marker right where my camera is looking, just below me, against the wall by the cage. If that happens, he won't hit you, but you have to stack up in melee and transition to phase. So anyone that's back a little bit too far, like our shaman on the left there, he would get hit by the Yeti there. So there you can see we got 20-ish, 21 maybe. So that's about what we're looking for on that phase. And the basic pattern is pretty much the same as the first time. We use our Druid's Tranquility as our big cooldown once we reach 15 or so. And prior to that, we use personals around 7, minor cooldowns between the personals and the trank. And then the kiting is exactly as we did before, except it's mirrored. So first 2 targets are going to the opposite wall that we started on. And then the next person will go across, and here comes the Yeti. So it's important to, again, watch where he's going and keep track of his timer, essentially. How long until his next Wrecking Ball cast where he charges across. And then need to be prepared for the next target. So I thought I might be valid, so I wanted to be in position there. I moved up the hall a bit. And you can see our target player was a little bit out of position, our paladin, so he had to use his rocket boots to get up there. And then the final target, again, goes to the back of the hall. So I actually messed up here. I should have gone to the other side of the boss, but I got frightened by the time I realized it. So normally, you want to have everyone that is not targeted by the last fixate on the side that you want to be positioned at. So the Yeti there is charging through us, and once he's done with that, you can kind of get in position. So This was our first kill, so this final phase is a little bit messy. We've since cleaned up our methods, essentially. But the basic idea is to have our range stack up kind of behind the melee. I talked about this in the animation, with the melee in front of us, so that when it comes time to transition, we just all move forward onto the melee, just like we would normally do. Meanwhile, with the fires on the ground, every time there's a fire dropped, your group rotates right, or counterclockwise in our case. And the tank has to do the same so no one gets breathed on. And then once it's time to transition, you stack up and do one more kite phase if needed. We had enough DPS to pretty much finish it off, but it was really close here. And yeah, it was scary. So, that is Heroic Thok the Bloodthirsty. It's an extremely difficult fight. Like I said, the most difficult up to this point in the zone, in my opinion. So, figure out your basic kiting strategy or positions before you even begin. That'll help a lot. Figure out your raid composition and how you're going to handle healing and tanking. And then once those things are in place, then it's just a matter of practicing. Just practice, practice, practice. If you exactly copy our kite method, that'll save you tons of wipes, because we spend most of our time trying to figure out ways to kite properly, especially without warlock portals. So I assure you that method will work for you no matter what your raid composition is. Anyway, that is Heroic Thok. As always, good luck. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe.